Well, just going to David Gruen. David, embedded in this is really the idea of where is Australia's ongoing comparative advantage going to lie in terms of dealing with Asia. And of course, when we talk about Asia, we're talking about a region itself which is changing dramatically in terms of its own education systems, its own sophistication, the quality of its output. So when you look at the future and the sort of transition for Australia this white paper is talking about, as an economist looking again beyond the mining and resources sector, where are the areas of Australian comparative advantage that can be exploited?
So I think it is important to make the point that this huge investment surge that Michael's been talking about in the mining sector is going to mean that the mining sector is a bigger part of the economy for a fair while than it has been in the past. So the mining boom is going through different phases. We've had the high price period, and now prices are on the way down, and the peak in investment is within sight over the next year or two. But there's a huge production phase which will last for a long, long time, which is why all this investment was put in place in the first place. So although it's true that Australia will find other elements of its comparative advantage, it's also true that mining will be a larger share of our economy for a considerable time to come, certainly out to 2025, which is one of the key dates in the white paper. But if you look beyond the mining sector, it won't, by the way, employ a lot of people in that phase because it's the construction phase that employs a lot of people rather than the production phase. And so just parenthetically, we're likely to see better productivity growth over the next 10 years than we saw over the past 10, simply because the production phase of the mining sector will by its nature improve productivity, improve the measures of productivity. That's not to say that a continued reform agenda wouldn't be a good idea. It would, but I think we are actually going to see better productivity growth in the next decade than we've seen in the past. So where are the other parts of, what other parts of the Australian economy are likely to do well? Well, to some extent I'm going to take the position that Michael took, which is that the government's role is to get the settings right, and it's the private sector's role to find out which things that turn out to be profitable. But I think it seems likely that agriculture will do significantly better, simply because one of the things that will happen as the middle class grows in Asia is that their tastes will change, and there'll be more high protein food that Australia has a comparative advantage in. And the other thing that's important, and I guess it's obvious, is that Australia will need to do is find niches. We are a small economy of 20-something million people, and there'll be 3 billion people in the middle class in Asia by 2030, and we'll have a lot of competition for goods and services supplying to that huge middle class, and so we have to find niches. And so there'll be a myriad of ways in which we do that, but it seems to me that there are profound changes going on in Australia's comparative advantage, and we have to accept that.
Okay, this opens up a whole range of issues. So just going to John Macfarlane, there are 2 or 3 points here, John, I wonder if you could focus on for us. The first one is the story, as David says, really going to be dominated by mining and resources for quite a long time yet? And to the extent that anything else comes along, is it likely to be agriculture? And what's this tell us? Because mining and agriculture are the old-fashioned Australian strengths going back to the 19th century. So this then raises the question about how good Australia will be at developing the sort of niche markets that David talked about. So what are your thoughts on those issues?
Well, look, a couple of things, Paul, that strike me. One, the first thing is investment to GDP in Australia is about 30%. just below, but sort of those levels. Many other developed countries, including the US and UK, are running 14, 16. And the delta between what many developed countries are doing and what Australia is doing is essentially the resource-based sector. So call it 15% of GDP. If you want to put numbers around it, the pipeline in the resources sector is 921 billion, I think, is the popularly quoted number, of which about 40% is already underway. The key thing I would say about that is we better well get it right. Because Michael and others have referred to the impact of capital investment on productivity, and I think that there's a huge amount of complacency in Australia around the nature of these projects. The statistics the popular statistics, of course, is that we're currently doing 9 projects that are greater than $15 billion, between $15 billion and $60 billion. 4 of those, of course, are in Western Australia. What's the relevance of that stat? Well, I always remind people that up until a few years ago, the largest infrastructure project undertaken anywhere in the world was the Three Gorges Dam, and that was a $26 billion project. So we're right up there. I think it's point number 1. Secondly, the BCA has done some very good work with independent project analysis, and I see Greg Gailey here, he may have been involved in the early stages of this. But what the work that they do, and they've reviewed 28,000 projects globally over the years, is that they say that 60% of projects that are greater than $10 billion tend to fail, and their definition of failure is that they run more than 25% over original budget or over timescale, or the combination of those two. So the rewards that we are going to ultimately derive from this huge capital investment phase are very, very dependent upon us delivering projects on time, on budget. And there's a lot of people in this room who, through the course of the next 2 days, will talk to that point. I think that will in turn determine the dividend that we have from the resources boom, Paul. Look, I'm a farmer. I'm a banker because my family were essentially failed farmers, if you want to think about it that way. And I'm a bit sceptical about the agricultural resources boom, and that's because of the point I made earlier on, is that I think that the industry structure in agriculture is very, very different than in the resources sector, and I think that we need to get an awful lot of microeconomic reform around agriculture before we can start to think about it as the next resources sector. I think much more potential for Australia rests in the services sector, in whether it's education, whether it's tourism, all the other things that Australia should have comparative advantage about. And I'm sure we're going to come on to talk about it next, but when you start thinking about those sectors, I think it really needs to draw your attention back to the need for microeconomic reform and increasing competitiveness. And let's not waste the benefits that we've got from this resources boom, erroneously.